Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. Like the trailing fringe of a wedding veil, the gentle September mist held fast to the hedge and sloping fields surrounding Little Skelton village. It was the sort of dawn that held secrets as well as comfort. The leaves were just starting to turn gold, the weather was cold, and the chatter was, as usual, a breath away from controversy. Fern Hollow, an ivy-wrapped Georgian home that had seen better days but yet had a certain theatrical flair, situated at the fringe of the settlement. Just 2 weeks after moving in, its new tenant, Mrs. Portia Wellborn, had already made a big impression on the hamlet. She had identified herself as a sensitive spiritualist and, more provocatively, indicated that she would be having a séance on the evening of the equinox. She was dressed in a series of flashy silks and frequently spoke of vibrations, spirits, and energies. There was no small stir when the notification was hand-delivered to a select group of recipients in looping violet lettering on heavy lavender paper. Almost everyone thought it would be intriguing, while some people snickered and some snarled. As she poured tea for her bridge group, Mrs. Lavinia Crewe said, "It's not the kind of thing one does, really. However, I guess she trailed off tactfully in these modern times, her gaze flitting to the invitation that was positioned directly below the silver toast rack. Miss Marple remained silent as she sat next to the aspidistra. She had the courteously uninteresting expression she used while she was listening intently. Miss Marple had not been invited in the first place. Despite this, she had received an invitation that had been pushed under her door one morning with a subtle sandalwood aroma and no message or explanation. She had folded it in half with a smile. The visitors started to arrive at Fern Hollow that same evening, when the sky was starting to turn a faint shade of lavender. Portia Wellborn welcomed them with a circlet of silver leaves at her temple and a flowing midnight blue gown. Elise, her sharp-eyed maid, escorted guests to the drawing room, where a table covered in black velvet was surrounded by a circle of seats. "There are 9 of us," Reverend Giles Bartram remarked, looking around the pew. It was a really unholy number, and his tone was dry. Portia chuckled quietly. "Some traditions consider 9 to be sacred, Reverend." Sitting next to him, Miss Marple just folded her hands in her lap and looked about the room. Only the flicker of the candles illuminated the dreary space. Mrs. Lavinia Crowthorne, one of the guests, appeared especially tense, she observed. Harold Greaves was a retired military guy, with a thundercloud temperament and a drinker's nose. Young, anxious, and gripping her mother's brooch too firmly, was Beatrice Fletton. The late Cornelius Sneed, who was somewhat of a dictator in the community before to his unexpected heart collapse last spring, was widowed by Mrs. Emmeline Sneed and the solicitor Lionel Kent. Martin and Dorothea Crane completed the circle. After spending years overseas, a couple came back to the village with strangely flattened accents from the distant sands. Martin was irritable and sunburned. Dorothea was unreadable and pallid. Portia sank herself into her chair, palms up, and said, "I ask that you open your hearts, because we are reaching into the vast unknown tonight." No veil was reached across by Miss Marple. She sat silently while the others, not Portia, watched. The quiver in her jaw, the rigidity of her spine, the way they avoided each other's eyes. Portia's voice became strangely quiet as it went deeper. "I'm observing a rusting garden gate. On the other side is a weeping child." She fluttered her eyelids. Something was buried. "Give a woman a number." She went by the name, then there was a crash. Beatrice Fletton's glass had fallen. It broke on the ground and reverberated in the tense quiet. Whispering, I'm sorry," she said. "I felt cold, like someone walked over my grave." Miss Marple ignored the shattered glass. She glanced at Harold Greves's sudden interest in the fireplace and Beatrice's whitened knuckles from pressure. Dorothea Crane had covered her mouth with her hand. Miss Marple could not yet tell if it was out of fear or to conceal something else. Slowly, Portia opened her eyes. "Tonight's spirits are uneasy." Shortly later, the atmosphere became brittle and the séance came to an end. In the conservatory, tea was served. Some visitors left early, while others engaged in tense discourse. Beatrice was one of the first to go, her scarf slung haphazardly across her arm. Miss Marple stood by a side table, aimlessly stirring her tea. She observed Elise returning to the kitchen with the empty teacups. She saw Emmeline Sneed's hand tremble slightly as she reached for a biscuit, and she saw Portia observing Elise with a faint distaste. The village didn't realize the real scandal until morning. There was no obvious chaos, no shattered furniture, and no indication of forced entry when Portia Wellborn was discovered dead in her bedroom. She had an empty glass by the bedside, her eyes closed and her body curled behind a paisley coverlet. On the dresser, a half-melted candle continued to glow. According to the doctor, it was heart failure. Following a lengthy stroll through the appropriately moist alleys and a few contemplative stitches in her stitching, Miss Marple concluded it was murder. Chapter 2. By the time the church bell rang 9 on the morning after the séance, Little Skeleton was already alive with whispers. It began as these things often do in the bakery queue, where Mrs. Tilling remarked almost as an afterthought that she had seen the constable bicycling up to Fern Hollow before breakfast. That alone was enough to make Mrs. Harrow forget her currant loaf and lean forward with eyes wide before breakfast. She gasped. But surely that can't be anything routine. No one's ever in a hurry for Fern Hollow, not even the milkman. Unless, added the vicar's housekeeper with the heavy pause of a stage actress, something dreadful happened during that spirit-summoning nonsense. That was all it took. By mid-morning, 3 versions of Porter Wellborn's death had circulated. One involving a ghostly possession, another suggesting poisoning by candle wax, and the third, perhaps the most popular, implying she'd been cursed by an Egyptian relic. Miss Marple, who received her news less from gossip than from observing the effects of gossip on others, listened politely as Mrs. Lavinia Crowthorne arrived on her doorstep, trembling with a sense of tragedy that barely disguised her excitement. Of all the ridiculous fads, Lavinia muttered, accepting tea without thanks. Seances, incense, talking to shadows. That woman was meddling in things no decent Christian ought to touch. She did seem rather fond of theatrics. Miss Marple agreed mildly. Lavinia nodded vigorously, then hesitated. Still, she didn't look ill, did she? I mean to say, you saw her last night. There was nothing to suggest a weak heart. I'm not a medical expert, said Miss Marple, brushing a crumb from the saucer. But she poured her own tea steadily enough, and her eyes were alert when they weren't theatrically closed. Lavinia sighed. The doctor's calling it heart failure. Poor man must be trying to avoid scandal. Miss Marple didn't reply. She simply refilled the teapot and glanced out toward the road. Elise, Portia's maid, was being led into the vicarage by Reverend Bartram. Her head was bowed, her dark braid limped down her back. From that distance she looked younger than she had the night before, frightened too. By noon, Harold Greaves had been heard in the Fox and Willow loudly proclaiming that séances were foreign to foolery, and that he'd warned everyone there'd be trouble. Meanwhile, Mrs. Emmeline Sneed refused to come out of her house at all. I heard she fainted when she heard, whispered Millicent Carroll, who claimed to have walked past the Sneed residence at precisely the right moment. Dorothea Crane, however, had been seen walking to the post office with unnerving composure. She posted a letter, exchanged a few polite words with Mr. Quibble, the stationer, and declined an offer for tea from Mrs. Winterfred Trott, something that in Little Skeleton was considered a silent declaration of guilt or grief, or possibly both. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her shawl and ventured out to the greengrocer's. She asked for plums and received pears, which she did not correct. She was more interested in observing who was speaking to whom and who wasn't. Lionel Kent, the solicitor, stood outside his office with his briefcase in hand, staring blankly at the brass plaque, as if it had just begun speaking Latin. His wife, an infamously sharp woman with no appetite for scandal, had arrived unexpectedly from Bath that morning, and the timing, as Miss Marple noted, was curious. It was also curious that Dicey had not returned to Fern Hollow. At 4 the constable made his second appearance of the day, this time accompanied by Inspector Welch from the larger nearby town of Heathmere. A stout, red-cheeked man with a voice that made shutters tremble. Welch was not known for subtlety. By supper time it was widely known that Mrs. Wellborn's cause of death was no longer being treated as natural. She was murdered, then? Asked Lavinia, aghast, returning for another round of tea. I wouldn't know, said Miss Marple, lifting a biscuit with delicate fingers. But I do know the doctor's signed certificate has been withdrawn. That's rather telling, don't you think? Lavinia's fingers trembled. And Elise? Do you suppose she'll be blamed? She was present, said Miss Marple simply, but so were many others, including ourselves. At that moment, a sharp knock interrupted the quiet of the cottage. When Miss Marple opened the door, she found young Constable Sims looking sheepish. "Sorry to bother Miss Marple," he said, tugging his cap. "Inspector Welch wonders if you'd be willing to speak to him." "Of course," she said without hesitation. "Would you like a biscuit before we go?" "They're oat and ginger." "Very good for the nerves," he blinked. Thank you, Mom, but I think we'd best be quick." Inspector Welch was waiting at the vicarage, having taken over Reverend Bartram's study as a temporary command post. Papers and photographs were already strewn across the tidy desk, much to the vicar's quiet distress. "Miss Marple," Welch said, rising with surprising grace for a man of his bulk. "Do come in. We're hoping you might assist. Not officially, of course. Just an extra pair of eyes." "How kind," said Miss Marple, taking the armchair nearest the fireplace. "I suppose you've spoken with everyone present at the séance." "We've started," Welch replied. "There's a bit of confusion, different recollections. Cleese, for instance, swears she saw Miss Welborn drink from her own glass and take a powder beforehand. Valiant route, apparently, but others deny seeing that. Mrs. Sneed said nothing of powders, Miss Marple noted, accepting a cup of tea from the vicar. She also claims the candles flickered violently when the name Marianne was spoken. "Who's Marianne?" asked Sims, still hovering in the doorway. Welch grunted. "That's the question, isn't it? No record of a Marianne connected to Welborn. Could be a ruse, could be nothing. Or," said Miss Marple gently, "it could be that someone in that room did know a Marianne and reacted to the name being spoken aloud." Welch raised a brow. "You're suggesting someone reacted emotionally and gave themselves away." "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple, "that the room grew colder, not because of the spirits, but because someone present suddenly remembered what they'd tried very hard to forget." Welch was silent for a moment, then leaned back. "Right, then I suppose we'll need to look into the Cranes' past. They were abroad too long for my liking. And perhaps," Miss Marple added, "you should ask Elise where Mrs. Welborn purchased her valerian powder. It may not have been valerian at all." As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple paused by the garden gate. A rusted hinge squealed softly as she opened it, a faint echo of Portia's spectral vision the night before. "A garden gate," she murmured half to herself. "A child crying and someone buried, but who?" She walked home slowly, the shadows lengthening behind her. The village still buzzing, but not with certainty, only with unease. Chapter 3. The following morning dawned crisp and pale, with a sky the colour of skimmed milk, and a faint tang of smoke drifting from the chimneys of Little Skeleton. It was the sort of day where everything seemed quiet. Too quiet, Miss Marple thought as she passed the churchyard on her way to the grocer's. She wasn't doing any proper shopping, of course, just 2 eggs and a small loaf, purchased more for show than need. Her real purpose was to walk, to observe, and most important of all, to listen. At the counter, she waited patiently behind Mrs. Hargrave, who was engaged in a loud dispute with Mr. Quibble over whether the tomatoes had been stored properly. Behind them, Dorothea Crane stood silently, holding a single lemon and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Miss Marble's eyes flicked briefly to Dorothy's shoes. Brown suede, well kept, but the sole of the right one was damp, darkened from water that hadn't come from village roads. The puddles there had long since dried. "Lemon drizzle?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. Dora startled, blinking. "Oh, yes, something like that." "Such a comforting cake," Miss Marple murmured, "though it never keeps well unless it's been wrapped in waxed paper." Dorothy gave a tight smile, nodded, and left without purchasing anything else. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned her attention to the others. The mood had shifted from speculation to defensiveness. Everyone was saying less, not more. That, in Miss Marple's view, was when the truth began to seep through. She encountered Reverend Bartram near the War Memorial. He was speaking with Leonel Kent, who appeared agitated. "You must understand," Kent was saying, "Mrs. Welborn came to me last week about amending her will. I told her it could wait until the following Monday. I never expected—" "Well, did she say what sort of amendment?" Miss Marple asked gently, inserting herself into the conversation with the practiced subtlety of one who had spent years doing so. Kent hesitated. "She intended to remove a beneficiary. She didn't say whom." Miss Marple gave a polite little nod. "That can cause all sorts of ruffled feathers." He looked away, not that anyone knew. She was quite secretive. Reverend Bartram coughed delicately. She also hinted to me that she had received a threat, an anonymous letter, though she wouldn't let me see it. Kent snorted. She was dramatic. That seance nonsense. Honestly, the whole thing riot of performance. I wouldn't be surprised if she invented the threat just to create an atmosphere. Or, Miss Marple said softly, to test someone. She left them with a gentle farewell and turned toward the green. Something was beginning to itch at her thoughts, a pattern half seen as when embroidery stitches show faintly through muslin. At the far side of the green she found Elise. The girl sat beneath the lianco-covered sundial, arms crossed tightly across her chest, her gaze lost in the motions of a beetle crawling across the stone. "You haven't returned to Fern Hollow?" Miss Marple asked as she settled beside her. "No," Elise murmured. "They said I could stay with the Cranston for now. I can't sleep in that house again. Not after seeing her." Miss Marple waited. "She didn't look scared," Elise said suddenly. "That's the strange part. People talked like it was something awful. But her face, she looked calm, like she'd expected it. Expected to die, to be taken, or to slip away. I don't know." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the beetle, now climbing a blade of grass. Was she in the habit of taking valerian sometimes? Elish said she claimed it helped her sleep, but she always added honey. Said the taste was foul otherwise. "Did she take it the night of the seance?" Elise hesitated. She poured it herself from the little green bottle, but her voice dropped. The bottle vanished afterward. "I know where she kept it, and it's not there now." Miss Marple's fingers paused in their slow folding of her handkerchief. "And did she usually measure it?" "Yes, 1 spoonful, always the same. And this time I didn't see her use the spoon." Miss Marple gave her a kind look. "Thank you, Elise. That may be more useful than you know." As she walked back toward her cottage, her mind wandered, not to poisons, but to people. People and the lies they told when they were frightened. She had been at that seance. She had seen Harold Greaves nearly spill his brandy when Portia mentioned a name, Marianne. She had seen Beatrice Fletton drop her glass, and she had noticed Leonel Kent's sudden interest in the floorboards when the candle flickered violently. And then there was Emmeline Sneed. Her hand had trembled when she reached for her biscuit, but not Miss Marple suspected, because of ghosts. Back at home she retrieved her knitting and let her fingers work automatically, her thoughts drifting. Who was Marianne? That name had been spoken just once. Portia had said it softly, as if it had come to her unbidden, and in that moment the room had turned, not physically, of course, but emotionally. A sharp intake of breath, a stiffness, silence. She laid her knitting aside and opened her bureau. At the bottom was a slim leather-bound notebook in which she kept what she called her social observations. Not a diary, certainly not a journal, just impressions, fragments, things people said and the way they said them. She turned to the most recent entry, the seance underlined in blue ink. She made a small addition beneath the list of attendees. Name spoken. Marianne reaction multiple. Greaves startled. Fletton dropped glass. Sneed went pale. Kent silent. Dorothea Crane unreadable. Elise unfamiliar with the name. Then underneath in smaller script, who is afraid of Marianne and why. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a call to Beatrice Fletton. The Fletton cottage was neat but cluttered, filled with doilies and the scent of old lavender. Beatrix's mother, bedridden with a bad hip, called faintly from upstairs, while Beatrice poured tea with hands that shook ever so slightly. Miss Marple declined the sugar and said conversationally, "That was a dreadful business the other night." Beatrice flinched. "Yes, I wish I hadn't gone. Seances do tend to bring out peculiar reactions, spirits or not." Beatrice gave a brittle laugh. "I don't believe in any of that rubbish." Still, when Miss Welborn mentioned Marianne, such an uncommon name, your glass slipped. Beatrix stiffened. "Did it?" Miss Marple smiled. "Perfectly understandable. Names can summon memories, can't they?" Beatrice hesitated. "I knew a Marianne once years ago, but it couldn't be the same. It's just coincidence." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Was it?" Beatrix didn't answer. She picked up the tea tray and left the room for a moment, giving herself a chance to collect whatever composure she'd nearly lost. When she returned, her smile was too bright. "More tea, Miss Marple?" "No, thank you," Miss Marple said, "but thank you for the conversation. It's been most enlightening." As she stepped back into the cool air, Miss Marple glanced toward the church steeple. The bell had not rung since Portia's death, a mark of respect or a silence that held something else entirely. The pieces were coming slowly, like loose threads begging to be drawn. Miss Marple could feel the pattern emerging beneath the surface, shapes forming in the weave. But someone in Little Skelton was working just as diligently to pull the wool over everyone's eyes, and soon Miss Marple thought someone else would slip. Chapter 4. By Wednesday morning, Inspector Welch had made up his mind. "We're focusing on Harold Greaves," he said firmly, as he stood before a chalkboard hastily set up in the low Reverend study. "Motive personal dispute means unconfirmed but likely opportunity. And temperament," he tapped the word with his stub of chalk. "Volatile. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, didn't interrupt. She rarely did in these circumstances, but she blinked once slowly and watched the inspector with the faint interest of someone observing a child working out a riddle. "You see," Welch continued, "he's the only one who openly disapproved of the séance, shouted about it in the pub that very night. In fact, Portia Wellborn's death might have been a crime of passion. Anger, intolerance. Perhaps he confronted her. Perhaps it got out of hand. But no signs of struggle," the Reverend ventured hesitantly. Welch waved it off. "Poison can be slipped into anything. Brandy, tea, or one of those powders she was always on about. No need for a struggle." Miss Marple set down her needles gently. "And the name Marianne?" Welch frowned. "A distraction. Could have been an invention. Portia was a showwoman. I'm not interested in ghosts. I'm interested in hard facts." "Then I fear," Miss Marple said mildly, "you may be digging in the wrong garden bed." Welch grunted but said nothing more. Outside, the village went about its usual business, but uneasily. Gossip had grown teeth. By now, everyone knew Harold Greaves was the main suspect. That afternoon, Harold was seen pacing along the river path, hands in pockets, face flushed. Later in the post office, he snapped at poor Mr. Quibble and stormed out without buying stamps. Someone claimed he had shouted something about bloody hypocrites as he left. Mrs. Hargrave declared she had always suspected him of something unsavory, though she wasn't sure what. Even Mrs. Crowthorne, who had once flirted outrageously with Harold at a parish dance, now crossed to the other side of the street. Miss Marple, however, remained curiously unmoved. She took her tea alone that evening and laid out her notebook once more. She drew a circle in the center of the page and wrote Harold Greaves in neat block letters. Around him. She listed what she had seen. Loud disapproval of séance. Unnerved when Marianne was mentioned. No clear personal connection to Portia. Public temper, yes. Private motive unknown. No known access to Portia's medications. She tapped her pen once on the paper and wrote, "Visible anger often hides other emotions, but does it hide guilt or grief?" At sunset, she walked to the edge of the village, where Harold's cottage overlooked the bramble fields. She found him on the small bench outside his gate, a bottle of stout at his side, and a weathered pipe in hand. "Evening, Mr. Greaves," she said pleasantly. He didn't rise, but he did tip his cap. "Evening, Miss Marple. Come to poke the angry bear?" "Certainly not. I came to check on a neighbor who seems to have been rather unfairly painted." He squinted at her. "You don't think I did it?" "I think you're a man who's lost something before," she said softly. "Your wife, wasn't it during the influenza outbreak?" His eyes narrowed. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Only that people who've known grief often react strongly to falsehood, and I wonder whether something Portia said reminded you of someone you've tried not to remember." He said nothing for a long while. Then he looked down at the pipe in his hands. "Marianne was my sister," he said finally. "Died when she was 17. Fell down the well behind the farm. Everyone said it was an accident, but she never went near that well. Hated it. And you never mentioned this." "No one's business," he muttered. "It was 40 years ago. Marianne's name brought it all back. That's all. I don't even know how Portia could have known it." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That may be the most telling part of all." As she turned to leave, Harold called out, "I didn't like her." "That's true, but I wouldn't have harmed her. Strange woman, but no one deserves that." "I quite agree," Miss Marple said over her shoulder. The following day brought a surprise. Joratha Crane arrived at the vicarage with trembling hands and asked to speak privately with the inspector. When she emerged 15 minutes later, the news spread like wildfire. Joratha claimed she had seen Harold place something in Portia's teacup just before the séance began. She was standing behind the curtain, said Mrs. Crowthorne to half the village outside. The butchers saw it clear as day, but she was frightened, said she didn't want to get involved. Didn't want to get involved, muttered Mrs. Hargrave until she had no choice. Miss Marple said nothing at first, but she did stop by the vicarage again that afternoon, this time to speak to Reverend Bartram. Dorothea Crane is not a liar, she said gently. But I don't think she told the truth either. The Reverend blinked. Then what do you suppose, Miss Marple? I think, she said, Dorothea saw something, but not what she claims. People often mistake a gesture in a moment of tension, and if one is already frightened, the mind fills in gaps. You believe she was coached? I believe she may have been misled, Miss Marple replied. Or perhaps she remembered something convenient rather than something true. That evening, as Miss Marple watched the mist return to the hedge, she reflected on the convenient nature of memory. Everyone seemed eager for the crime to be simple. A man with a temper, a woman with spiritual fancies, an argument, poison, done. But Miss Marple knew from long experience that the truth often wore less obvious clothing. She sat at her writing desk and opened her notebook again. She drew a second circle, this time Dorothy, a crane. Beneath it she wrote, claims to have seen Harold tamper with teacup. Previously calm. Why the shift now? Declined tea from Mrs. Trott day after death. Posted a letter next morning. To whom shoes, damp soles, garden water, hidden errand. No visible emotion during séance, but reaction to name Marianne. Another line scribbled with more urgency. Dorotha's husband silent throughout. Travels frequently. Why so invisible? Then a final note for the night. Marianne's name meant something to more than one person. Harold reacted. So did Beatrice. So did Dorotha. Miss Marple closed the book. The inspector might be charging down the path toward Harold's Greaves with all the energy of a foxhound on scent. But Miss Marple, with her soft hands and slow step, was moving steadily toward a different kind of answer. The sort of answer that doesn't bark but rustles, that creeps in quiet places, that waits beneath words left unsaid. And somewhere in Little Skelton, that answer was about to be disturbed. Chapter 5. Rain came on softly that Thursday morning, a light misting drizzle that blurred the hedge and gave the streets of Little Skelton a silvery sheen. Miss Marple, having polished off her porridge and seen to her canary, fetched her mackintosh and umbrella and set out with deliberate calm. She wasn't headed anywhere in particular. That was the trick, really. Appear as though you're not looking, and you'll find far more than if you appear to be searching. She wandered first to the churchyard, then through the lane by the grocer's, and finally, as those remembering it last minute, down the back path to Fern Hollow. The house had been locked since Portia's death, but Elise, still in the village and still frightened, had agreed to meet her by the garden gate. She said she kept everything tidy. Elise whispered, as she passed Miss Marple a small brass key. But that last day she was restless, moved things around, left her brooch out on the writing desk, which she never did. And I found this. From her coat pocket, Elise produced a folded paper napkin. Inside it was a button. Black, flat and ordinary, except for a curious silver notch along its edge. Where was it? Under the dresser, Elise said in her room. I thought it belonged to one of my cardigans, but I checked. It's not mine. Miss Marple turned the button over in her gloved hand. It doesn't match anything Portia wore during the séance, she said softly. And she wouldn't have gone crawling under the furniture, but someone might have dropped it, or someone might have knelt. Kneeling, Elise's voice was nearly a whisper. Perhaps to add something to a teacup, Miss Marple said gently, or remove something from the room. Miss Marple thanked the girl and slipped the button into her handbag. With Elise's key in hand and no one watching, she let herself into Fern Hollow. The house was cool and undisturbed. The scent of incense still clung faintly to the drapes. She moved through the drawing room slowly, eyes flicking over the placement of chairs, the angle of the drapery, the candles that had burned low and left waxy petals on the black velvet table. It was in the writing room, Portia's study really, that Miss Marple paused. On the desk lay a single sheet of cream-colored paper, half tucked beneath a leather blot. It wasn't a letter. Not quite, more like a list. Miss Marple tilted her head. Names, dates, notes. She read Marianne Greaves, 1886. Accident or no? Dorothea Crane. Correspondence from Marrakesh. Check dates. Lionel Kent. Will revisions discussed privately. Emmeline Sneed, husband's heart attack unusual. Check Dr. Penrose's timeline. Beatrice, mother's financial dependence. A chill passed through her. Portia had been compiling something. A private investigation, not of spirits but of secrets. She glanced again at the button in her handbag. Then she looked toward the fireplace. Something wasn't quite right. The rug, a thick Persian carpet normally straight and symmetrical, had been shifted barely, but enough that the corner curled where it shouldn't. Miss Marple knelt, ignoring the ache in her knees, and tugged it back. Beneath the rug, hidden along the floorboard seam, lay a small brown vial, empty. Miss Marple stood slowly, brushing her skirt. Her expression was unreadable. The vial matched nothing in the medicine cabinet upstairs. Not valerian, not anything Elise would have touched, and it was hidden too carefully to be merely forgotten. She locked up again without being seen, and returned directly home. That afternoon she requested a visit with Inspector Welch. "Two things, Inspector," she said, as she settled in his office at the vicarage. "First, I found an item you might wish to analyze for traces of any unusual substance." She handed him the small brown vial. He raised his eyebrows. "Where did you in the fireplace?" She said truthfully, if not fully, "Concealed beneath the rug. Not something one finds lying about by accident, wouldn't you say?" "And the second?" "This," she said, placing Portia's list gently in front of him. Welch read it once, then again. His face shifted. "She had dirt on everyone," he muttered. "She had interest in everyone," Miss Marple corrected him. "There's a distinction. Some of these notations suggest she was watching for patterns, inconsistencies. Not gossip, Inspector, curiosity." Welch sat back. "So someone killed her to keep her from sharing what she knew, or what she might have known. And that," Miss Marple added, "is a far more dangerous threat." Welch tapped the list with a finger. "This changes things. Harold may have had an emotional reaction to that name, but he wouldn't have known Portia was collecting details about the others. He doesn't move in those circles." "Exactly." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with her embroidery, listening as the wind picked up outside. Her mind moved not with speculation but with confirmation. She had seen the cracks. The button had opened the first door. The list had opened the second. And now a question echoed at the edge of her thoughts. Who knew Portia's habits well enough to move quietly through her room, perhaps during the séance itself, and retrieve or plant something unnoticed? She thought again of Doratha, of her sudden testimony, of the damp soles on her shoes the morning after the séance, of the letter posted in haste. Then she thought of Leonel Kent. He'd had access to Portia's legal matters, her will, her money. He knew where things were kept. And yet he'd seemed oddly anxious that morning. Not after the death, but before anyone knew it was suspicious. Miss Marple retrieved her notebook once more and drew a symbol, a circle within a square. It represented Fern Hollow. In the circle she listed only two names. Doratha saw something she didn't understand or misunderstood entirely. Lionel, knowledge of will, evasive, overly precise, avoids emotional questions. Then underneath, in her fine looping hand button, too ordinary for Portia, too feminine for Graves. Matches Kent's overcoat. Must check. File not Ellis's, not from cabinet. Could have come from Kent's own satchel. Legal men carry more than pens. The village would sleep uneasily that night, lulled into the belief that Harold Greaves was at the center of the storm. But Miss Marple knew storms often swirled outward from much quieter places, and someone somewhere had dropped a button carelessly, thoughtlessly, in haste, a mistake so small, so ordinary that no one else had even seen it. But Miss Marple had. Chapter 6. By Friday, the mood in Little Skeleton had turned brittle. The village was no longer merely whispering about Portia Velborn's death. It had begun to calcify opinions into something resembling certainty. Unfortunately, those certainties shifted with each passing conversation. At the grocer's, Harold Greaves was still eyed with quiet suspicion, though the force of the gossip had begun to scatter. The arrival of the list Miss Marple had found, quietly shared by Inspector Welch, to only a few key figures had complicated things. "Why would she keep a list like that?" muttered Mrs. Hargrave over her apples, like some kind of spy. "She was a spiritualist," said Mr. Quibble, frowning. "They take notes. It's all about reading people." "No," said Lavinia Crowthorne with sudden clarity. Portia wasn't reading them. She was recording them. The implication was clear. Portia had secrets and, more importantly, She had others' secrets, and secrets Miss Marple knew were Little Skeleton's true currency. Later that morning, she received an unexpected visit from Beatrice Fletton. The girl was paler than usual, her hands worrying at the strap of her handbag. She declined tea but accepted a ginger biscuit, which she nibbled with the delicate anxiety of someone unsure whether to eat or weep. "I needed to ask you something," Beatrice said finally, about Portia. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Go on, dear. She said something to me the week before the séance about inheritance." Miss Marble's brows lifted slightly. "Did she?" she said jokingly. "I thought that people often pretended to be someone they weren't when money was involved." Then she looked at me and said, "Your mother's been cleverer than most." I didn't understand what she meant. "Did your mother know Portia well?" "No," Beatrice said, flushing. "But she's been short of money and Portia was wealthy. I suppose I wondered she trailed off." The implication hung unspoken. Miss Marple, however, had already begun to form a shape in her mind. "Did your mother know Mr. Kent?" Beatrice hesitated. "They used to attend the same charity committee years ago before her hip made outings difficult." Miss Marple nodded. "I wondered, dear, if your mother might have sought assistance in ways you weren't aware of." Bit said nothing, but her trembling hand reached instinctively for another biscuit. Later, when Miss Marple walked toward the green, she found Inspector Welch pacing with a familiar creased forehead. "Dora's recanting," he grumbled. She might have been mistaken about what she saw Harold doing with the teacup. "Says it all happened so quickly. Fear can tangle the memory," Miss Marple said gently. "Or guilt can," Welch snapped, then sighed. "We've spoken with Kent again. Said he hadn't seen Portia the week before she died. But now we've got a lease saying she brought him in through the back door that very Monday." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "The back door? That's always where the real stories happen." Still no sign of the missing bottle, Welch continued. "Lab confirms residue in the vial you brought contained powdered belladonna. Lethal in high doses, not valerian at all." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Then Portia was murdered, and someone took great care to disguise it." "More than care," Welch said darkly. "Premeditation." Miss Marple looked out over the green. "Did you ask Kent why he visited Portia that day?" "He claimed it was to advise her on tax filings. Said nothing unusual occurred." "Did he admit to knowing about the change in her will?" "He denies it. Claims he never saw the revised draft." Miss Marple pursed her lips. How convenient. That afternoon brought a second visitor, this time to her cottage. Emmeline Sneed arrived without warning, clutching a shawl and a small velvet pouch. "I can't keep it anymore," she said, pressing the pouch into Miss Marple's hand. "I should have said something. I was afraid." Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was a locket, gold, worn at the edges. Inside was a photograph of a man and a woman, Portia, and someone vaguely familiar. "That was my husband," Emmeline said softly. "Cornelius." Miss Marble's eyes met hers. "I thought he passed of a heart attack last spring." "He did," Emmeline whispered. "But it wasn't natural. Portia knew. She sent me this locket before she died. Said I should prepare myself for unpleasant truths. That's how she put it. I think she suspected me." Miss Marple set the locket on the tea tray. "Did you give Cornelius belladonna?" "No," Emmeline said, barely audible. "But I think someone else did. Someone who wanted him and Portia gone. Someone who profited from both deaths." Emmeline looked away. "Cornelius handled Kent's financial affairs. There were irregularities, but he never acted. He said Leonol was useful, and Portia, she told him she was revising her will. Said she'd left something to me. She thought I'd earned it. She said Cornelius was furious. He thought she owed him." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Did he ever tell you what Portia knew about him?" "Number, but I think Kent might have or used it." That night, Miss Marple reviewed her notes once more. She added a new section. "Cornelius Sneed, sudden death in spring. Portia's locket sent to Emmeline. Implied knowledge. Kent equals common link. Access to Portia's legal affairs and Sneed's accounts. Portia amended will. Kent claimed ignorance. Elise confirmed secret meeting. Kent equals pressure point. New secrets possibly feared exposure." She stared at one phrase. "Someone profited from both deaths. Kent wasn't loud. He wasn't impulsive, but he was careful, controlled, and everyone who came too close to uncovering something had ended up silenced." Except Miss Marple, not yet. Chapter 7. The sun rose through a gore of mist the next morning, making the trees around Little Skeleton appear ghostly and half-formed. It was the sort of morning where the village stirred slowly, unsure whether to believe in light or fog. Miss Marple was preparing her tea when the knock came. Not the usual gentle tap of a neighbour, but a sharp, hurried pounding that sent her canary fluttering. It was Inspector Welch, red-faced and tight-lipped. "I need you at Fern Hollow, Miss Marple. There's been another incident." Within 10 minutes she was back inside the ivy-covered house. The parlour now stripped of its séance trappings. A constable stood by the open window, his notebook damp with drizzle. Welch led her to the back study where Elise sat pale and trembling on a floral set. "There was a break-in," Welch muttered. "During the night. No signs of forced entry, but Elise swears she locked all the doors." "I did," the girl whispered, her eyes darting to the shadowed corners. "I always check twice." Miss Marple lowered herself beside her. "What was taken?" Elise swallowed. "Not money, not jewelry, just papers. The folder from the writing desk, the one she kept locked." "The folder that held her notes?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Elise nodded. "And the second will Welch paste. We'd been looking for it. Kent claimed it hadn't been finalized, but if Porsche was keeping a draft..." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Someone knew where to find it. Knew Elise was staying with the Cranston last night. Knew the house would be empty. And took only the folder," Welch muttered. "Not even the silver candlesticks." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Inspector, might I examine the window?" It was open just an inch. No scratches on the latch. No footprints in the flower bed below. "A practiced hand," she murmured. "Or someone with a key." Welch turned to Elise. "You're certain it was locked?" "I heard a noise. That's why I came early. I found the drawer open. The folder gone." Miss Marple looked out into the grey garden, her eyes thoughtful. "May I speak with Lionel Kent?" Welch gave her a sharp glance. "You think he—" "I think she said that a solicitor who claims not to have seen a second may become very interested in ensuring it remains unseen." Lionel Kent was in his office, a tidy red brick building at the edge of the village square. When Miss Marple arrived, he greeted her with his usual distant politeness. "Miss Marple, how can I assist you?" She offered a pleasant smile. "I had a small matter to clarify regarding Mrs. Welborn's revised will." He blinked as I told the inspector. "No such will ever cross my desk." "No," she said gently, "but it was discussed." "On the Monday before her death. Elise confirms she brought you in through the back entrance." His face twitched. "She may be mistaken." "I don't think so," Miss Marple said. "In fact, I believe Portia entrusted you with a draft, one she intended to formalize, removing a beneficiary, wasn't it?" "I don't see the relevance." "The relevance," said Miss Marple softly, "is that Portia died 2 days later, and the only document that could have contradicted the current legal record has now vanished." Kent leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "If there had been such a document, and I'm not saying there was, it might not have held legal weight. But it would have implied motive," she said, her voice still gentle. "If, for example, you stood to lose something in that second version." He stared at her for a long time, then smiled thinly. "That would be quite the story, wouldn't it?" Miss Marple inclined her head and took her leave. Back in her cottage, she reviewed her notes again. The list of suspects no longer danced in circles. They narrowed the button, the missing vial, the secret visit, and now the break-in. Each detail had its own gravity, and all of them drew toward one name. But still, something was missing. That evening, as the rain returned in earnest, Dorothea Crane came to call. She was nervous again, less composed than usual. "I'm worried about Martin," she said abruptly. "He's changed. In what way?" "He's restless, short-tempered. He said I shouldn't get involved with the investigation, that I'd already made things worse." Miss Marple poured her tea carefully. "You were frightened, Dorotha." "That's nothing to be ashamed of." Dorotha shook her head, but I didn't imagine it. "I did see something during the séance. It wasn't Harold, but it was a man leaning forward. I thought it might have been Martin, but I couldn't believe." She stopped, eyes wide. Miss Marple gently touched her hand. "Sometimes what we can't believe is exactly what we need to consider." "I don't know what to do." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Trust your instincts, and trust that truth has a way of surfacing, especially when someone tries too hard to bury it." After Dorothea left, Miss Marple sat in silence. The pieces were nearly aligned. But now a new question emerged. Had Martin Crane known about Portia's second will? Dorothea's hesitation, Martin's anger, his desire to keep her from speaking, and what had he been doing the night of the break-in? The next morning, a final twist came. The constable arrived at Miss Marple's door, holding a folded letter. Delivered anonymously. "We think you should see it." She opened it slowly. No signature, neat block lettering. There was something buried behind the well at Fern Hollow. "Ask Elise. Ask her what she saw that morning." Miss Marple blinked once, then rose to fetch her coat. Chapter 8. The morning after the anonymous letter arrived, Miss Marple set out for Fern Hollow again, this time with a purpose stitched tighter than any of her embroidery threads. The air was sharp, the earth damp beneath her sensible boots. At the rear of the garden, past the tangle of dead hydrangeas, and beneath a leaning iron trellis stood the well, long sealed with a rusted grate and half choked with ivy. The same well Portia had vaguely mentioned during the séance, a garden gate, a child crying, something buried. And now Miss Marple stood before it, hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes narrowed at the ground behind it. Elise arrived soon after, summoned by a polite note. She approached hesitantly, hugging her cardigan around her thin shoulders. "You said you wanted to see the garden," she asked quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "You came early the morning after Mrs. Wellborn's death, didn't you?" "Yes, I thought I heard something in the night." "I didn't sleep well." "You came by the back, didn't you?" Elise nodded again. "I always take the shortcut. It leads through the hedge behind the vicarage." "Did you notice anything odd?" Elise hesitated. "Only that someone had moved through the flower beds, footprints, and, well, something half buried." Miss Marple turned to face her fully. "Go on." "There was a scarf," Elise whispered, "sticking out of the dirt. It had been trodden into the earth. I thought maybe a fox had pulled it from the rubbish pile. Do you still have it?" "I put it behind the shed." "I was afraid." Miss Marple offered the faintest of smiles. "You've been very brave, Elise. Let's have a look." Behind the shed, Elise retrieved a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was the scarf, silk pale blue, faintly perfumed. It was stained with soil and something darker, rust or dried blood. Along the hem, a name tag had been sewn. "Hem Crane." Miss Marple gently refolded the scarf. "I believe this may be exactly what we need." That afternoon she called upon Inspector Welch. "We must be very careful," she said, placing the scarf on his desk. "Someone is watching closely. They've already removed evidence once. They may try again." "Cra?" Welch asked grimly. "I suspect so, but we must not accuse him." "Not yet. He won't confess. He's too controlled. But he will react." "You have a plan, then?" "A very small one," she said mildly. "All we need is a little theatre." That evening, Miss Marple made sure word circulated through precisely the right mouths. Lavinia Crowthorne whispered to Mrs. Harrove, who passed it to the stationer, who shared it with the grocer, who told Dorothy a Crane. And within 2 hours, the whole of Little Skeleton knew that evidence had been found buried near the well. No one said what kind. No one had to. It was enough to stir the air. Miss Marple invited Dorothy to tea the next morning. The woman arrived subdued, hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression hollow. "Is it true?" she asked about the well. "There was something," Miss Marple said gently. "A scarf." Dorothy flinched. "Martin's?" "I believe so." Dorothy looked down, fingers clenched in her lap. "He said he'd been out walking that night, couldn't sleep, but he came in smelling of damp earth." I asked, and he shouted. "I didn't push." Miss Marple poured tea. "You must be very frightened." She nodded. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "you came here anyway." "I needed someone to hear me," Dorothy whispered, "before it all falls apart." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the green as Martin Crane crossed toward her. His smile was a little too wide. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "I hear there's been a little excitement." "Only a trifle," she said. "The garden scrap. I do hope people aren't jumping to conclusions." "People do that," she replied, "but conclusions are curious things. They require something more than gossip. They require behavior." He tilted his head. "And whose behavior are we watching now?" "Oh," she said, "everyone's the night." The vicarage received a report of a disturbance. A figure had been seen in Fern Hollow's back garden, crouched by the well. When Welch and Constable Sims arrived, they found Martin Crane standing by the trellis, his coat muddy, his hands trembling. "I was looking for my scarf," he said coolly. Dorothy seed it had gone missing. In the dark, Welch asked, "It had sentimental value." Miss Marple, observing from the path, said quietly, "And such a rush to retrieve it. Curious, isn't it?" Martin's gaze flashed. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," Welch said, "but we'd like you to come to the station." Miss Marple turned back toward the gate, her expression unreadable. The trap had closed, but she knew this wasn't yet the full truth, because murder rarely begins with rage. It begins with fear. And Martin Crane, for all his composure, had just proven he was afraid. Chapter 9. Martin Crane sat across from Inspector Welch in the vicarage study, his brow furrowed, and his damp coat steaming slightly in the heat of the coal fire. Outside, the rain had returned, soft, relentless, and oddly fitting. It made little Skeleton feel like it had stopped breathing. Miss Marple stood at the fireplace, her shawl neatly folded over her arm, her expression calm but sharp as pins. "We'd like you to explain," Welch said bluntly, "why you were in the Fern Hollow garden last night, muddy and alone, retrieving a scarf you never reported missing." Martin leaned back. "I told you. Dorothy mentioned the scarf. I thought I'd check." "You thought to visit a closed estate in the dark?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "How considerate." He said nothing. Welch leaned forward. "We also have a scarf, Mr. Crane. One discovered buried, stained, soiled, tagged with your name, hidden just behind the well." Martin's jaw worked, planted. "Then you won't mind if we compare it with your wardrobe?" Miss Marple asked. He looked away. "I must admit," she continued, "that I wondered at first whether it was you or Lionel Kent, but then I remembered something Portia said." Welch blinked. "You never mentioned Portia said anything significant." "She didn't at the time, not directly, but it returned to me. During the séance, she spoke of a rusted gate and a woman buried behind the garden. At first I took it as dramatic flair, but Portia was not as fanciful as she pretended." Martin scoffed. "You're basing your accusation on séance ramblings." "No," Miss Marple said. "I'm basing it on behavior and timelines and fear." She turned to Welch. "Let us start, shall we?" Welch gestured. "Go on." Miss Marple stepped toward the center of the room. Portia Wellon arrived in Little Skelton, not to perform séances, but to observe. She was in her own way an investigator. Her notes prove as much. She was collecting information on various villages, including Lionel Kent and Emmeline Sneed's late husband. But most interesting of all was her quiet attention to the Cranes. Dorothy, seated in the corner, swallowed audibly. Martin Crane had known Portia before, not intimately, but professionally. He was involved years ago in an investment that went sour, a firm tied to misappropriated funds. Portia, I suspect, recognized him from that. She began watching him quietly. Her notes mention Marrakesh, where the Cranes had lived, and letters Dorothea sent that never reached their recipients. Martin stood. "This is nonsense." Miss Marple raised a hand. "Please, Mr. Crane, allow me." He sat slowly. She also revised her will. According to Elise and Emmeline Sneed, she intended to remove Kent as her solicitor and designate a new beneficiary, one we now believe was Emmeline herself. She confided this to a handful of people, and that is where the danger began. She turned toward Welch. "Inspector, the poisoned valerian bottle was hidden cleverly, but only after the fact. Someone entered the room during or just after the séance and added it to the scene. We now know the bottle contained belladonna, not valerian. Police confirmed Portia did not measure her dose that evening, as she usually did. It had already been tampered with. And who had access?" Welcher asked. Miss Marple turned. "Martin Crane. He slipped away during the séance, perhaps during a dramatic moment, as everyone's eyes were closed or half-closed. He placed the altered powder in Portia's teacup, or perhaps already had, then replaced the original vial later to maintain the illusion of a natural death." Martin snorted. "You can't prove any of that." "No," Miss Marple said calmly, "but you attempted to retrieve the scarf. A small careless mistake. You see, Martin, you wore that scarf the night of the séance, the same one Elise found, buried clumsily behind the garden well, a telltale token of your rushed concealment. Had you left it where it was, it might never have been noticed. But fear, Mr. Crane, is a powerful motivator, especially for men like you, controlled, tidy, calculating. The idea of a trace left behind was too much to bear." Welch leaned forward. "And the break-in, the second will?" Miss Marple nodded. "Also, Martin Dorothy was away that night. The house stood empty. He knew where the draft was kept. He'd heard Portia mention it to Kent, perhaps even seen it himself, and he destroyed it. Martin rose again, voice tight. You're building a fantasy from scraps. You've no confession, no proof. Miss Marple met his eyes. But you will confess, Mr. Crane, because Dorothy has already started to doubt you, and fear, as I've said, is contagious. All eyes turned to Dorothy. She looked at Martin, truly looked at him for the first time. You told me Portia was dangerous, she said quietly. That she would ruin us, but she only ever tried to help people. Dorothy, she stood. You said we couldn't go back to Marrakesh, that it wasn't safe, that we were followed, but it wasn't that you were hiding. Martin's mouth opened, closed, his hands clenched. I was trying to protect us, he said hoarsely. Everything we've built, everything I rebuilt, she threatened to unravel. For what? Some scrap of morality. You killed her, Dorothy said. Didn't you? Martin looked around the room. His face was blank, and then slowly he nodded. I didn't mean to at first, he murmured. But when she mentioned the will and Emmeline, I knew she'd already written me out. I had nothing left to lose, and she was going to expose me. He looked at Miss Marple. How did you know it was me? She stepped closer. Because you tried too hard not to be seen, and only guilty men fear attention before questions are even asked. Chapter 10. The confession had quieted the room. Martin Crane sat hunched on the edge of the vicarage study chair, no longer defensive, just resigned. Dora stood by the window, arms crossed, her eyes red but unreadable. Inspector Welch had made no move yet, only watched stone-faced, and Miss Marple, seated calmly by the fireplace, gave the smallest of nods before speaking. I believe it's time, she said gently, to make everything plain. Welch cleared his throat. Please, Miss Marple, let's hear it straight through. She folded her hands neatly on her lap, her tone soft and deliberate. The key to understanding this case wasn't the murder itself. It was the behavior before and after it. That is where the truth resided, not in the teacups or the séance theatrics, but in the choices made under pressure. She turned slightly toward Dorothy, not unkindly. Portia Wellborn's death appeared natural. A peaceful-looking woman found in her bed, no overt violence. But even in that moment there were inconsistencies. Her regular dose of valerian was unmeasured. The bottle was missing, later replaced, an act not of panic but of planning. The vial Elise found in a fireplace proved the powder was not valerian at all but belladonna. Welch nodded. Poisoning by someone who understood her habits. Precisely, said Miss Marple, and someone who had enough proximity and nerve to carry it out unnoticed, during the séance no less, when attention was scattered and eyes were shut. That narrowed the field immediately. She turned toward Martin, though her voice remained gentle. You were familiar with the layout of Fern Hollow. You used your role as a passive observer to slip away, and your composure afterward, too smooth, too distant, stood out. You inserted yourself just enough without revealing your hand. Martin said nothing. He simply watched the floor, but the real trail, Miss Marple continued, emerged through a pattern of silences. You never expressed outrage when suspicion fell on Harold Greaves. You never asked who might benefit from the change in Portia's will. You never reacted to the discovery of her notes. She turned to Welch. You'll recall Mr. Crane's alibi, the supposed restlessness during the night of the murder, his walks, his evasiveness when asked about Portia's revised legal arrangements. He denied everything, Welch muttered. And yet, Miss Marple went on, we know Elise saw Kent enter Fern Hollow secretly on Monday. Portia likely told him about the will and her suspicions of Martin. Kent, however flawed, did not act, but Martin did. Why not Kent? Welch asked. He had motive. He did, Miss Marple said, but he is a man of calculation, not risk. Kent's behavior revealed guilt of omission, not of action. He removed himself from the affair, hoping the matter would blow over, or that Portia would lose interest. But Martin Crane is different. He feared not just loss of inheritance but exposure. His past in Marrakesh, his fraudulent financial dealings, and possibly his role in the suspicious death of Cornelia Sneed, all would have come to light. A stir from Dorothy. She swallowed hard but said nothing. Portia may not have had evidence, Miss Marple continued, but she had enough suspicion to frighten him, when she began implying she would change her will to name someone else. Perhaps Emmeline Sneed or even Dorothy Martin acted, and he did so efficiently. The scarf, Welch murmured. Miss Marple nodded. A telling mistake. He dropped it behind the well during his hasty cleanup after retrieving or destroying the revised will. He later tried to recover it, but by then Elise had already spotted something half-buried. The anonymous letter Miss Marple received was likely from someone who saw him that morning, or suspected the truth and feared it would go unnoticed. Dorothea Welch asked, but she shook her head. "Number, I didn't write anything. I only saw how frightened he'd become." Miss Marble's voice softened. "And fear, as we've said, is revealing. It draws out truths more effectively than confrontation." She turned back to Martin. "Even your attempt to cast suspicion on Harold via Doratha's false memory was rooted in that fear. You nudged her subtly, urged her to remember what she hadn't seen, but guilt cannot hide forever, not in Little Skeleton." A long silence settled over the room. At last Martin spoke. "She was going to ruin everything," he muttered. "Not just the inheritance, the past. Doratha and I rebuilt our lives after Marrakesh. We escaped and Portia was dragging us back into it. You had a choice," Doratha said quietly, her voice steady now. "You always had a choice." He didn't respond. Welch stood. "Martin Crane, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Portia Wellborn. You'll be charged formally once we've submitted the evidence. Do you understand?" Martin Rose nodded once and allowed himself to be led out. The door closed behind him. Doratha remained by the window, unmoving. Miss Marple rose and approached her gently. "Would you like a cup of tea, my dear?" Doratha gave a faint, weary smile. "Yes, I think I would." They crossed into the vicarage kitchen. The kettle had just begun to whistle. Chapter 11. The village of Little Skeleton did not erupt into scandal after Martin Crane's arrest. It recoiled. People moved a little more quietly, spoke a little more softly. No one said his name aloud, not even in the butcher's queue or behind closed curtains. A veil had fallen over the lanes and hedgerows, a silent pact that tragedy, when it occurred so close, must not be prodded. The official proceedings came swiftly. Martin offered no defense. His confession witnessed and signed was enough. Inspector Welch traveled to Heathmere with a complete file of evidence. The scarf, the destroyed will's remnants recovered from the fireplace grate. The forensic results from the belladonna vial, all neatly catalogued. The authorities had what they needed. But justice, Miss Marple knew, rarely ended with a trial. It lingered in echoes, in glances, in altered morning routines. Dorothy Crane moved out of the cottage within a week. She said little to anyone. Miss Marple saw her once, standing at the train station with a small trunk and a single hatbox. They exchanged no words, only a long look and a gentle nod. Beatrice Fletton, once pale and quiet, had become more withdrawn. She visited her mother daily but was rarely seen elsewhere. Rumour had it she'd written to an aunt in Devon for an extended stay. Lionel Kent, though legally unscathed, suffered his own quiet punishment. Clients withdrew politely but firmly. His brass nameplate lost its shine. The scandal had brushed against him too closely, and in a village like Little Skeleton, proximity was guilt enough. As for Emmeline Sneed, she remained tucked behind her curtains. No longer feared, no longer whispered about, but never fully trusted either. Too many secrets had swirled through her late husband's affairs. Too many shadows remained. One afternoon, Lavinia Crowthorne came to tea with Miss Marple and spoke what many had been thinking. "It's odd," she said, dabbing her lips, "how things almost feel unchanged. The same hedges, the same vicar's sermons, the same gooseberry jam at Mrs. Hargrave's, and yet there's something underneath," Miss Marple said quietly. Lavinia nodded. "Like the village is holding its breath." "It is," said Miss Marple, "because truth unsettles more than a lie ever could." Lavinia studied her for a moment. "You knew it all along, didn't you?" "I suspected," Miss Marple replied, "but I needed Martin to reveal himself. The more clever the killer, the more invisible their guilt, but fear always gives them away in health." The end. Lavinia sipped her tea. "I do hope it ends with peace." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It ends with understanding. That's quite different." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her armchair beside the hearth, her knitting idle in her lap. She thought not of justice but of consequence, not of the bold act but of its quiet ripples. Portia Wellborn had come to Little Skeleton as a stranger. She had peeled back the village's facade, seen what lay beneath, and paid for that insight with her life. And yet in her strange and theatrical way, she had left a trail of truth behind her through notes, through gestures, through one final séance that said more than anyone had realized. Miss Marple recalled Portia's voice. There's a gate, something buried, a name that brings shadows. And so it had. The next morning, Miss Marple received a letter. It was unadorned, unsigned. The handwriting, however, was unmistakably Dorothea Crane's. Dear Miss Marple, thank you for seeing what I could not or would not. I'm not sure where I'm going yet, but I know it's away from all this. Perhaps that's cowardly. Or perhaps it's the first brave thing I've ever done. Please keep the book I left in your porch. Portia gave it to me years ago. I think it was meant for you. With quiet gratitude, Deus Marple stepped out to the porch and found a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Between its pages lay a pressed gardenia and a single sheet of cream stationery. In Portia's hand the past is patient, but it never forgets. For those who see clearly, the truth is always present. You see more than most, dear Miss Marple. That is your gift and perhaps your burden. Père Bartholomew. Miss Marple closed the book gently and set it beside her tea tray. Justice had come to Little Skeleton, quietly, inevitably, with no fanfare, only consequence. Chapter 12. The wind had changed in Little Skelton. It no longer carried the faint, lingering tension that had hovered since the night of the séance. Instead, there was a silence of acceptance, a hush that came after the last bell tolls when there is nothing left to say but everything still to feel. A week had passed since Martin Crane's arrest, and already the village had begun adjusting. Conversations shifted gently back toward harvest suppers, vicarage rotas, and the possibility of a harsh winter. But beneath these familiar rhythms lay the shape of something no one would name aloud. In her sitting room, Miss Marple sipped her tea and opened the envelope that had arrived from Heathmere Crown Court that morning. Inspector Welch had written as promised, enclosing the official confirmation of Martin Crane's signed confession, as well as a summary of the findings. She read the evidence provided, including the scarf retrieved near the well, the laboratory confirmation of belladonna in the residue of the decoy vial, and the destruction of the revised will, was corroborated by Mr. Crane's full confession signed before 2 witnesses. He has pleaded guilty to the murder of Portia Velborn and is to be remanded in custody, pending sentencing. The matter of Cornelius Sneed's death is under reopened investigation. A second note handwritten in Welch's firm script followed. Miss Marple, I should very much like to know how you saw it all before I did. Gratefully, IWW. She smiled faintly and tucked the letter into the side of her writing desk. There was no pride in being right, only responsibility. She had done what needed doing. That was all. Later that day, as clouds gathered once more over the edge of the hills, Elise came to visit. She looked more at ease now. The tall line of worry across her forehead softened. They've let me stay on at the vicarage until I find another post, she said. The Reverend's wife is teaching me to keep accounts. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. You're clever, Elise. You'll make something for yourself, I'm sure. Elise hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded letter. I didn't know if I should give this to you before, she said. I found it in the hidden folder, the one Portia kept in her writing desk. I think it was meant for you. Miss Marple unfolded the letter carefully. My dear Miss Marple, if you're reading this, it means I've either succeeded in making a difference or I've paid the price for trying. Either way, I suspect the truth has been uncovered. And if it has, I owe it to your eyes which see so very much beneath the surface. I came to Little Skelton not just for peace but for reckoning. I had questions about Martin and Dorothea, and about others as well. Perhaps I meddled too much. Perhaps it was never mine to solve. But I could not look away from shadows once I saw them. If I'm no longer here, please see that what I learned is not buried with me. And if possible, offer kindness to those who feared the truth. Fear is the real poison, you see. Yours in watchfulness, Portia W. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and returned it to Elise's hand.